Welcome everyone to Stats and Scheme with Tage and Shawn. I'm your co-host today, Tage Seth, here with my other co-host, Shawn Syed. Today we are going to be talking about 3 interesting stats and scheme points from week 1 of the NFL season. It was so good to have a full slate of NFL games again, and I know that we're both extra excited about it because I got to look at some new data, you got to watch some new film. It was really good to have that after the long off season. Shawn, which topic do you want to talk about first today?
Let's start with the most exciting offensive performance of the weekend, and that was without a doubt the Miami Dolphins. Last year, the Chargers were one of the few teams that gave the Dolphins a tough time, so I really wanted to see what would Mike McDaniel learn from that game, and then what adjustments would he make in week 1. So last year, Miami would run this motion all the time where Tyreek Hill would start on one side of the field and then go all the way across to the other side of the field, crossing behind the center, and then get a running start into his route. Because that motion would take time, the whole defense was able to see it, adjust to it, and try to get into a better position to play against it. Now, for most teams, they still didn't stand a chance against all that speed, but the Chargers did a pretty good job of using their 2 high safeties to morph the coverage based on that motion on the way to a win last year. So this year, in week 1, instead of running that long motion that crosses the center, Mike McDaniel would get to the same concepts that he wanted to, but instead have players run quickly out to the same side of the formation and then get vertical up the field. So instead of starting in 3-by-1, where you have 3 receivers to one side and then 1 receiver to the other, then motioning one of those 3 receivers over, they could start in kind of tight 2-by-2 sets, get that running start a lot quicker, and it made it harder on the defense because if the plan was to communicate it, let's change our structure, let's rock and roll and figure out what we're going to do here, it was happening so fast that the structure couldn't change. That out motion, it also allowed the Dolphins to use a few different formations. It could feel more like run looks. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, is McDaniel going to use that same motion in the run game? How are defenses going to kind of counter that? And then how does the punch counter punch continue? But when you were looking at the stats, what did you see from that game?
I think the motion part is exactly spot on for what the Dolphins were trying to do, what Mike McDaniel was trying to do. The Dolphins had 31 passing plays with motion and 16 passing plays without motion. On the plays with motion, 22 for 31, 11.5 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. Without motion, 6 for 16, 7.4 yards per attempt, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception. So the motion was just huge for them in that sense of just increasing the ceiling of their pass offense, having Tyreek Hill have one of the best performances of any receiver of the past couple seasons, what played a big part of that. And I think it was really important. What you mentioned was when Mike McDaniel uses motion, it has a purpose. He has a plan in place for why he wants to use motion. You look at some other teams in the league, and we talked about this last week, where motion doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a more efficient play than not motion. The median motion play from an EPA perspective is about the same as the non-motion play, because you look at teams like the Steelers that just use motion just to use motion and aren't getting a purpose out of it. I thought the Dolphins did a really good job of making sure that why they were using it was really helpful for changing the defensive structure of the Chargers, and you saw that play out a lot on Sunday.
Yeah, the Dolphins, their speed combined with that motion, it was cool to see Mike McDaniel make just really a small adjustment when you're watching it, but it had such a big kind of downstream effect there that I can't believe, in week 2, we get to see, all right, well, now how does Bill Belichick game plan for that? That's really exciting because the Chargers used so much man coverage, maybe a little bit to our surprise in week 1, and watching on the film, they at least challenged the receivers a little bit. I don't know what the best coverage would be to play against the Dolphins because they are so good. And Tua really had a special game where I'm always going to talk about X's and O's, but it's such a players make plays league. I think that PFF charted him as something like 8 big time throws. And on tape, the biggest thing for me was he was making second reaction plays where the Chargers took advantage last year of, if we can stop your initial look, we can make you work off your spot, force your eyes somewhere else, maybe get you out of the pocket. Tua was doing that. He had to do that a few times, but he hit that crazy long ball to Tyreek when he's kind of stepping up in the pocket. He was able to get out of the pocket, hit receivers in stride. And if Tua continues to do that, if he can stay healthy, that is something that defenses are almost hoping for, because they say, I don't want to let Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle just run down the field. If Tua has to get to his second and third read, moving out of the pocket, maybe we live with that as a defense. But if they're beating you, I just on that, I'm just not sure what you do as a defense.
Mhm. Exactly. I thought this was the game of Tua's career. We saw him have answers to the test when the answer wasn't as obvious as it was last year. Last year it was so much in structure, it was so much quick passing game and being able to move down the ball down the field. Everything was under 2.5 seconds, and the Dolphins offense thrived on that for the first half of the season. But then second half of the season, we saw that because of what the Chargers did to them and what some other teams did to the Dolphins offense, they weren't able to live in that world anymore. But Tua ended up with the highest total EPA of any quarterback of this week, and that's including a red zone fumble early in the game that cost him. He had by far the highest pass EPA because of that. And then the middle of the field passing was there for Tua and the Dolphins as well. The Dolphins passed 33% of the time over the middle of the field. The NFL average is 21%. It's very hard to pass over the middle of the field, as we've talked about before. And there's an article on sumersports.com about that. But when the Dolphins were able to do that, they passed for 13.1 yards per attempt over the middle of the field. Non-middle of the field passes went for 9 yards per attempt. So we can really see just so many ways for the Dolphins to get these advantages against the defense using motion, middle of the field passing. They didn't even have a run game in this game. They had a sixth percentile EPA per rush, but their passing game was so effective. Even though the Chargers didn't need to respect the run game, they were still able to move the ball and put up the 36 points.
Yeah, and the run game was something that I thought of, that I looked to thinking, what is Mike McDaniel going to do? And maybe over the course of the year, we do see more of it. But yeah, you said, I think 99th percentile passing, 93rd percentile pass rate over expected, 6th percentile EPA per rush. So it's wild to see a team that everyone knows they're going to attack you down the field. They're going to use their speed. And Mike McDaniel is pressing all the right buttons. He's just doing it, right? I do want to see going forward, what do those run looks look like off of it? How our defense is going to morph? And man, I keep saying, I just don't know. I was watching the film over and over thinking, well, if you have a safety cutting off Tyreek Hill in one way, is that going to help? But just snap after snap, when Tua is playing like that, like you said, I thought it was the best game of his career as well. Just awesome to see.
And the really interesting thing that the Chargers did was they played man on 80% of their passing snaps. And I was on the record last year saying that even though Justin Jefferson might be slightly the better receiver than Tyreek Hill, I thought Tyreek Hill was the more important player to his offense because he completely eliminated man coverage against him last season. Tyreek Hill only saw 81 snaps of man coverage last year. For reference, Stephon Diggs and Justin Jefferson saw 100 more snaps against man than Tyreek Hill did, because you just don't want to have a defensive back matched up against him given the speed. And the Chargers and Brandon Staley went completely back to man. So when we look ahead to next week, this Sunday night game against the Patriots, where the Dolphins are currently 2.5-point favorites, it's going to be a really interesting game. We know that Bill Belichick loves to play man coverage. His defenses have been built on it, and the Patriots defense played really well with really good defensive backs. What do you kind of see the Patriots doing? Well, are they going to play as high a rate of man coverage as the Chargers did? Is it going to be something in the middle, or do they go more zone?
So the Patriots, especially last year, I think Bill Belichick was a little bit more flexible. They were playing some more of those too high coverages. They had more back end flexibility, but in week 1 against the Eagles, their front played really, really well. It was a rainy game. They were playing middle of the field closed coverages where they were playing cover 1, they were playing cover 3. But last year against the Dolphins, Belichick and the Patriots, they did play more zone. I think that idea is, you say, we're going to play off of this. We're going to not let you catch the ball, but if you catch the ball, we just need to be able to tackle that. It's really easy for us to say into microphones. That is really hard when Tyreek Hill, who maybe he is better than Justin Jefferson, but he is so good after the catch. And Jalen Waddle is as well. He can just erase angles with how fast he is. I think last year, Tua against cover 1 against the Patriots, he was like 8 for 8 with something over 140 yards. So to me, it may not just be, okay, we're going to play man coverage against this, even though the Patriots have a lot of flexibility on the back end. It's partially about hopefully throwing different looks. It's partially about, can the front win early in the snap, early in the downs, so we get to more third and longs and get into more situations where we're forcing Tua off that spot. And, if we're saying that Tua had the best game of his life just this weekend, if he can replicate that every single time, you got to tip your cap. But I think Belichick is going to try and challenge him in that way.
Well, the really interesting thing about Tyreek Hill in this game, and why I think you can be even more optimistic about the Dolphins offense going forward, is we normally know him as when he has these giant receiving games. Like I think about 2020 against the Buccaneers in the regular season when he had 200 yards going into halftime, and then this past weekend when he had 215 receiving yards overall. Is only 52 of those 215 receiving yards came after the catch. He had 227 air yards, which just dominated the league. You look at someone else like Chris Olave, who had 112 receiving yards on Sunday, for example. He had 64 of those after the catch. Usually when we see these 100-yard games, especially from this type of receiver, it came after the catch. But for Tyreek Hill, a lot of that was through the air. So I think that's why it's like just so hard to beat you, or to stop the Dolphins offense, and why they can beat you is because there's going to be games like this where Tua is able to air it out and Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are able to take advantage of that. There's going to be other games where maybe it's a lot of after the catch short passes, taking advantage of if you give them too high shells, or you're playing softer coverages. So I think that's what's really interesting from going into this game, is like which version of that Dolphins offense is Mike McDaniel going to get into?
Yeah, it can be difficult, I think, to divvy up who is going to get all the credit. But to me, who cares? It's such a cool combination of incredibly versatile fast receiver who is a very good route runner as well. Obviously good after the catch. Awesome that he had so many yards before the catch. An offensive play caller who, I mean, he's pushing Kyle Shanahan for sure, right? I think he wants to push him this year. He wants to get that top spot, keep challenging Andy Reid as well. And then a quarterback who the system is being built around him and taking advantage of at least some of his skills. So it's that awesome triangle. And I know that we talked about offenses. Tej, I know you wanted to talk about defenses first. I consider myself a defensive guy. And across the league this year, I think, or across the league in week one, it seemed like the defenses were just ahead a bit. Now, sometimes in week one, it's the offense had the whole entire preseason. They didn't really take any snaps to their first team. Defense is, of course, more reactionary. It can be more instinctual sometimes, where the offense has to have their timing down. They have to make sure their routes get to the right depth, and quarterbacks are still trying to figure that out. Of course, we had some weather issues, but for our second point, we're going to talk about defenses fighting back, which I want to keep seeing defenses fight back. So what did you see in the stats? Maybe give us a lay of the league in week one. How are defenses? What were they doing to beat offenses a little bit? What did the numbers say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, based on what we just talked about with Dolphin Chargers, you would think that the league is having an offensive explosion right now. But there are actually only two games last week where both offenses had above average production when look at their EPA. Dolphins Chargers, which a lot of us expected, and then Raiders Broncos was the sneaky one, where the offenses were actually pretty good despite what the final score ended up saying there. But overall, when you look at the league as a whole, this was the lowest week one offensive production going all the way back to the data that we have in 1999. It was the lowest from an EPA standpoint, and then a second lowest from a success rate standpoint. So not only were offenses having some of these negative plays that were leading to negative EPA, but they also weren't staying on pace either. They weren't being able to sustain drives. And it wasn't just a pass or a rush issue. This was the second lowest EPA per pass of any week one since 1999, and the third lowest EPA per rush. The Browns defense, the Cowboys defense, the Commanders defense all had top 30 week one performances of any defense since 1999. So when you just look at all of these things together, we had some elite defensive performances, but just across the league, only 11 out of 32 quarterbacks had a positive EPA per play. We usually see this number be around 16 or 17, just because passing is more efficient than rushing, and that leads to positive EPA. So for only 11 of the 32 to have that, I think it was just a huge week for the defenses to take advantage of either some offenses that weren't prepared from a quarterback standpoint, from an offensive line standpoint, or just other various factors like you mentioned with the weather or different things like that.
You know, the Browns and the Cowboys, I think, and we saw this with the Lions a little bit, where something I liked when I was watching on film, and it's also something you can see on TV, where the defense will move their pass rushers along the defensive front, right? So we're not just aligning our edge player on the tackle. We're doing different things on the inside to change it up. If you have a star pass rusher, if they're comfortable moving around the line from different spots, find your best matchup and try to exploit it. The Browns did it with Myles Garrett. They did it more over the center. The Cowboys did it. I mean, Micah is one of the just fastest get-offs that I think I maybe have ever seen. He did it against the guard for the Giants. And I was excited, like I said, when the Lions, who maybe they're not expecting to be a top defense in the league, they did it with Aiden Hutchinson, who is, I just think, still emerging, where he moved over the guard. So if you're in a known passing situation, you have to be able to just give yourself better matchups and try to dictate the terms of engagement to the offense. Now, I'm not saying never rush Michael Parsons from the edge, right? We want guys like Max Crosby get their hand to the dirt. Sometimes your stud edge rusher has to go against a tackle, probably a majority of the time, right? Offenses can help that with a tight end chip or the running back chip to slow that down. But offensive line across the board, it's a weak link system where sometimes you're only as good as your worst pass protector. Even if an offensive line doesn't necessarily have a weak link, the defense can still give edge rushers different opportunities where they're over the guard working inside, or maybe they're commanding the offensive center to kind of create a double team there, which that lets the defensive line have a one-on-one elsewhere. It can force quarterbacks out of the pocket. We saw it with the Giants a bunch, but the Cowboys have a concept where they will just let Michael Parsons hunt on the inside, and they'll have their safety come down all the way from deep and play kind of a spiral just chasing the quarterback. So you do have to understand, if we move our guy inside, is that going to change how the pocket breaks? Do we have to have edge guys kind of containing? But whatever you can do, if you are just going to run all of your snaps against the tackle, maybe you're getting pressures all the time, but change it up for the quarterback, the offensive line. They have to be able to communicate, okay, 11 is there. We know that Michael Parsons is over our right guard. We need to make our center get over there. That can kind of let defenders go elsewhere.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought up what defensive lines were doing against these offensive lines in week one. I think that is the main reason why defensive production was so high in week one. Was you just saw a super high pressure rate, higher than what we usually see. There was a league-wide pressure rate of 37% in the first week of 2023. That's the highest of any week in any season since 2020. So we're just seeing crazy amounts of pressure on the quarterback. You think about that Cowboys Giants game on Sunday night, where the Cowboys got pressure on 67% of passing plays. If you get pressure on a play, it's on average a negative EPA play. Clean pocket, no pressure, no hit, no hurry is usually a pretty big positive EPA play, especially depending on how long you hold the ball. The longer you hold the ball onto with no pressure, the greater chance of having a high efficiency play. And then the longer you hold the ball against pressure is the greater chance of a lower efficiency play as that play progresses. So we just really saw, teams like the Giants just getting pressured so often, not being able to do anything, and having to either get rid of the ball or taking 9 sacks. And then we also saw the Browns getting only an average rate of pressure, but being able to fit like how they wanted to limit explosive passing plays, moving Myles Garrett around, like you mentioned, having him line up over the center a couple times. You think about the crossover play that went viral on Twitter where he was lined over the center, and thinking about how that increased his chance of sack. And when I built a probability of sack model for the Big Data Bowl last year, the biggest feature in the model that determined the probability of you getting a sack based on your alignment and other game situation factors on a play was your distance from the quarterback. And this makes intuitive sense. The closer you are to a quarterback, it would make it a lot easier to pass rush them. Obviously, then you consider double teams happening more inside than outside with centers and guards. But the distance to the quarterback was still the biggest feature in that. And I know that this is something that the Browns have talked about, have looked at before, is kind of manipulating the chance to get pressure. Jim Schwartz, their defensive coordinator, has been doing that for decades now in the NFL, where he thinks about mixing up his defensive line. And so the Browns putting Myles Garrett over the center, decreasing his distance to the quarterback, increased his chance of getting a sack, and that ended up happening on multiple plays.
That point is pretty interesting. I think the distance to a quarterback is cool, right? So we're going to run in a straight line to get them. But I love seeing people on that edge being able to really, sometimes it's not a foot race to the edge, but where a defensive end is able to get that speed, they're able to dip under that tackle. It's certainly so aesthetically pleasing. and just makes life hard. But we have so many good defensive linemen, not just edge players, right? In New York, we got obviously Dexter Lawrence, Quentin Williams for the Giants and the Jets. It's so hard to play offensive line, and I think it's underappreciated. It's a hard thing to continue to break down and think, oh, well, this guy let up a sack. Does that mean he's good or bad? Where you can have 80 snaps from an offensive line where all your 5 guys are all there. You're not rotating out like the defensive line. And if you, quote, lose on 2 plays, if you let up 2 sacks, maybe one goes for a fumble, or maybe one pressure leads to an interception, your day is done. So I feel so bad for the offensive linemen. They have such a hard job, especially now we're seeing teams with really deep defensive lines where you have not just 4 guys that can get after it, they have 5. Maybe they have 6. And defensive coordinators that they're switching their mindsets to be more attacking towards the offense and try and manipulate protections in different ways. So we'll have linebackers that they'll pretend like they're rushing the passer, but they're just playing man coverage on the running back because it forces the running back to stay in protection, which means the offense only has 4 eligible receivers, and the defense might feel more comfortable saying, well, maybe we don't love our chances playing, 7 on 5, but 6 on 4, maybe we feel better with that, with how we leverage against the receivers. So going to be fun to keep watching. It seems like Michael Parsons and Myles Garrett, I don't know if they're in a group chat where they're trying to one up each other. They're sending each other their highlights, but those guys are after it. And I mean, one of those guys, it looks like they're going to get like 20 sacks this year.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And we have both of them projected top 5 in sacks, along with TJ Watt and Aaron Donald for the rest of the season. So I think it's going to be really interesting to follow that sack rate. But the point about the offensive lines, I think that you brought up, is something I want to go a little bit deeper on. We usually see these types of performances where games get away from offenses because of poor offensive line play later in the season, when there's some scenarios where teams just have 3 of their offensive line that are hurt, and they're rolling out a majority backup line, which you talked about with the weak link system earlier. That's multiple weak links that defenses can take advantage of. And like you mentioned, defensive lines are so talented right now, especially interior and even some of the edge rushers. But for this to happen in week 1, I think is really surprising. You would expect a lot of these offensive lines to be healthy, and a lot of them were coming into the year. But a lot of the big takeaway from people in preseason was how the drop off between starting offensive linemen to backup offensive linemen, and how much it limits you from an offensive perspective when you're starting these backup offensive linemen. The Dolphins, surprisingly, without Teron Armstead, their best offensive linemen were able to have a great offensive production. But there's teams like the Giants, like the Bengals, or even the Bears, which you could debate whether that's mostly Justin Fields or their offensive line, that already have major question marks at their offensive line that maybe didn't exist before this week, just because they got beat up so badly in that area on the field.
Yeah, overall, there are just more good defensive linemen than there are good offensive linemen. It's not a comment on is offensive line harder, is defensive line harder, whatever that is. If a defensive lineman gets hurt, a lot of teams, now there will be a drop-off, but that drop-off is certainly less than, if your left tackle is out, even if your right guard is out, if your center is out, where they're the person that will be working with the quarterback to communicate protection a lot of the time, it is an absolute headache. It does not matter if you're drawing up the nicest, the fanciest pass plays that you have. If there's a player sitting in the quarterback's lap, it is going to be a hard time for the offense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I totally agree with that. And I think it'll be really interesting to follow the rest of the season. Offense, just because of regression to the mean, is most likely going to bounce back. But for now, I mean, just you think about some of the defensive performances this week, the ones we've mentioned, have to mention the Jets causing 4 turnovers against the Bills on Monday night. That and Breece Hall being a big reason why they were able to pull off that upset win. Like you can really start to see some of these elite defenses impact games. I think that it's been known for the last couple of years that most of the time elite offenses will beat elite defenses in matchups, but now you're starting to see these elite defenses like the Jets, like the Cowboys, just completely take over games and take average offenses, which the Bills aren't, but the Giants might be, and just like completely wreck the game for them, make sure that they can't have any production, and make it kind of look like a college football game early in the season or something. So we'll talk about here. Let's talk about how one of the ways that offense might be able to get back to playing at the level that we're used to that. And that's bunch passing concepts. So you can take us through what a bunch passing concept is, and then kind of what the advantage is for offenses using these.
So a bunch, it's 3 receivers in a close alignment with one of the players on the line of scrimmage. They're the point player. And then you have a player on each of their sides. So we're going to think about triangles when we're talking through this. They're really making a triangle. On the whole coverage menu that defenses have, there are specific bunch checks, meaning there's a smaller subset of fairly standard and fairly understood adjustments that defenses will play against bunch. And that reduces what the quarterback needs to figure out, and it can give the offense an advantage just by formations.
Yeah, so when you talk about the specific bunch checks, how do defenses exactly defend that?
So there are multiple ways to do it. First, there's a little bit more of a zone mentality if offenses are trying to create a ton of traffic, where the defense also looks like a triangle with a defender pressing that point man of the bunch in man coverage, and then 2 other defenders further back where the inside defender is playing the first inside release, and then the outside defender is playing the first outside release. So you're a little bit more comfortable if the offense sends the inside most receiver of the bunch to the outside and the outside receiver of the bunch inside. But then to counter that, teams will just run maybe 2 inside releases or a second release that's delayed going in that same direction as the first player, because that can throw off the defensive leverage when you know the rules of the defense, and then the defense has to adjust in a different way again.
So if the offense knows the kind of the answers that the defense is going to give it, is there another way that defenses can kind of adjust to bunch concepts once the offense kind of throws out that first answer? Or is that something that defenses have to get through with a different kind of method or scheme?
One other way that we see bunches played, it's called lock and level. It's a more man coverage mentality for dealing with the bunch. So in lock and level, we have a defender pressing the point man of the bunch in man coverage. Then you have 2 other defenders that kind of back right and back left point of your triangle. They're in off leverage. They're locked in man coverage, where the outside defender is playing the outside receiver on offense, and then the inside defender is playing the inside receiver on offense. So they're at different depth levels to avoid being picked from one another. So the lock is the man coverage, and then the levels is that depth difference, which makes up lock and level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is starting to make a lot of sense. I think it's really interesting to kind of see how it's going back and forth between the offense and defense. So looking specifically at this week, where did you see any examples on film that stood out of teams using this?
My early favorite examples were from the Patriots and the Rams. So they were both examples against lock and level. The Patriots example, it's versus the Eagles. It was a touchdown with 30 seconds left in the second quarter. And remember, in lock and level, the outside defender is playing man coverage on the outside receiver. But since the bunch is more of a condensed formation closer to the offensive line, the outermost receiver can threaten the defense to that created outside space and then open up space to cut inside and underneath it. And that's really exactly what the Patriots did for a touchdown, where the cornerback was threatened deep and outside because there's more space, because of this bunch, and then cutting up the field for that touchdown. The Rams had a really fun example with 11 minutes left in the third quarter, where they motioned a receiver. They were in a 3 open set, or sorry, 4 open. I think it was a 4 open set, but 3 receivers to one side, not in a bunch yet, but they motioned that far outside receiver into the bunch, get a running start, and then that outside back right point of the triangle player crossed over to the inside of the bunch a few yards down the field before running all the way up and back out to the sideline and pretty much just made it a foot race. So we have our bunch. We know that we're getting lock and level. We know that the outside defender is playing man coverage on our outside receiver. We know the inside defender is playing man coverage on our inside receiver. Let's make it a foot race. So hopefully that just gives a little bit of a better idea. Some of the reasons why offenses go into bunch sets in the passing game. That's 2 ways that defenses can play it. Then how offenses can manipulate those rules. And hopefully that's something on Sundays you can look for. And every time you see that triangle on offense, see how the defense is adjusting to it and see if the offense is trying to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you brought up the Rams, because The top 3 teams to pass out of bunch sets last week were the Dolphins, 49ers, and Rams. They all had the highest yards per attempt out of bunch concepts as charted by Pro Football Focus. And I think about those 3 play callers, how they share a similar identity on offense with where they've come from and where they are, and then kind of how they have that same tree that it's stemming from, where they're able to get into a lot of these concepts. But you can see this tree kind of spread its roots amongst the rest of the league. Week 1 of 2023 had the second most bunch concepts of any week dating back to 2021. So now you're really seeing a lot more of these offenses using that. Like I think about some other offenses that maybe don't come from that Mike Shanahan tree that are now starting to get into that, like we saw with Bill O'Brien's passing game. Getting into that a little bit more from the Patriots perspective, and then just also these different answers that offenses are having to what defenses are giving them, I think is going to be another interesting thing to follow.
When defenses install their defense, they have their core list, right? They want to get to their base concepts. They want to say, how are we adjusting to this formation? And then they have a specific part or within formation, specific checks for their coverages against bunch. So to me, that shows, okay, if the defense has to maybe not devote a full day to it, but they almost need like a period of their practice time to say, what are our bunch rules? And then early in the season where we were saying, defenses felt ahead of offenses, the defenses that I was watching, I think all of them didn't have their bunch rules down fully, or even if you have your rules down, offensive coordinators are so good at manipulating defensive rules. I think as resources get better across the league, teams continue to watch each other. You have the film. You can see, the Rams use this bunch concept against the Seahawks. I wonder what's going to happen next week. And then the Eagles defense had a little bit of trouble against bunch concepts. Now in week 2 on Thursday night, the Vikings should run some sort of bunch and see were the Eagles able to kind of hammer that out over that few day period. So bunch, it's certainly a part of every offense. It's not just married to one tree. But it's interesting to see play callers that we kind of crown and say, these are some of the best guys that are doing it. Those are the people that are getting to bunch concepts to try and find easy answers, try and simplify the coverage. And really, you're just trying to find a way to put your players in the best positions to make plays. And sometimes that is giving the quarterback a somewhat simplified read, forcing defenders into specific leverage that you can manipulate and then going ahead and getting after it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I always saw the Sean McVay hire for the Rams as not only you're hiring a really good offensive mind and someone who's proven out to become a Super Bowl winning head coach, but also someone who is going to really understand Pete Carroll's coverage rules, why the Seahawks use cover 3 so much like they did in the past, and how to beat that heavy cover 3. And when you look at just the history of Rams Seahawks since McVay has gotten there, McVay has had the upper hand multiple times, and we really saw that play out Sunday. The Rams had the second most total pass EPA behind the Dolphins last week without Cooper Kupp. They were using Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell, players that weren't seen as top-end wide receivers, but both going over 100 receiving yards. And I think a large part of that was not only Matthew Stafford playing at a really high level that we saw pre-injury, but also Sean McVay having a better understanding than anyone of Pete Carroll's defensive rules and how to manipulate them. And that's why the Rams offense was able to play so well as the Seahawks, and partly why the Rams are still pretty big underdogs to the 49ers on Sunday, and their Super Bowl odds haven't increased that much is because it might have been more of the Rams taking advantage of a matchup that they usually do well in, more so than the Rams being a really good team. So if you're a Seahawks fan looking for some optimism, I think that's where it stems from. Is this is a matchup that you guys haven't done well in the past with. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the defense is going to be as bad the entire year as it was in that game.
Yeah, poor Pete Carroll. I think he's just a really great coach, but every year, 4 times a year, you got to play against McVay. You got to play against Shanahan. And then Shanahan and McVay get to watch each other's teams, which, of course, those offenses are made up differently. The Rams don't have George Kittle and Kyle Juszczyk. The Rams are in sort of a different phase, I think, along their team building process. But Shanahan gets to see what were McVay's answers to the Seahawks. Then McVay gets to see what were Shanahan's answers to the Seahawks. So, Poor Pete Carroll. We make life so hard for these defenses. We get offenses to be able to dominate sometimes. Defenses get to be able to dominate other times. But every single week, it's so fun seeing what's the push and pull. What are the different points where, I'm sure next week we're probably going to talk about the Dolphins. I'm probably going to convince you again. We're just going to talk about these guys week after week because they're the people that in a lot of ways are pushing the game forward because they're the most innovative. And a lot of times it is just based on this team was the most successful, where Sean McVay running outside zone is not the most revolutionary thing in the world, but the way they use certain emotions is really cool. When we watch I love seeing the Dolphins take a play and then the Rams use that same sort of concept in their offense. So it's all these people borrowing from each other, which is probably what you should do if you're in the NFL, right? If you can teach the scheme, take the best plays that are just breaking defenses and figure out how to mold it into your structure.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think it's a big reason of why Pete Carroll, who primarily played single high, especially Legion of Boom, worked out very, very well for them throughout the years. Last year, and now I'm expecting this to stay the same this year, is they're increasing the amount of quarters that they play. They had Shawn Desai, who's a Vic Fangio disciple, in the building last year, and they were increasing just how much too high shells they were throwing out, I think partly because he was there to help them process that. Now he's with the Eagles, but I still expect that to stay the same. Bill Belichick, the same way. I mean, this is a small sample size here, but 2% quarters in 2021 to 8% in 2022. Now we're seeing him innovate on defense. He has had so much success playing his style of man coverage, heavy cover one defense throughout his career. But now he's understanding, because of offense innovation and because offenses have spent so long studying these really high-end defenses like the Seahawks with Pete Carroll, like the Patriots with Bill Belichick. Now we're kind of seeing the answers to the offense's answer to that.
It's interesting to see the Fangio tree, who, that I'm a believer in it. I really like a lot of those ideas. But for example, the Browns now with Jim Schwartz playing just a so much more aggressive style of defense. And I feel like I'm sort of being convinced because quarterbacks are so good. They are able to see the defense, feel it in different ways. But if you can force the issue, if you can cause maybe pressure, maybe just the appearance of pressure, where the Vikings defense under Brian Flores, of course, under that Bill Belichick tree, he is going to attack you. And it doesn't matter what the talent level is on defense. They're going to force the terms of the engagement onto their side of the battlefield. They want to make your offensive line work. They want to get your quarterback just to hold that ball for a touch. They want to see, do you have the answers for this coverage? So while it's fun to see offenses get in a bunch concept, see if the defense adjusts, when defenses are fighting back, to me, that's where a lot of the fun is, for sure. Even though we're obviously watching a game that it's kind of built for offenses to succeed, and we all want to see Patrick Mahomes keep throwing touchdowns, keep scoring points, except for against your Lions, of course. But watching defenses continue to go forward, going to be fun to focus on those teams that are using bunch concepts in different ways. Are these teams checking in different ways? Is it something where maybe it's just players at a certain point where, if you have that fast guy going down the field, it's going to be really tough for us to cover that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think that's what makes looking ahead to the week 2 slate really exciting, is we're going to see a lot of those answers potentially happen in these primetime games. We have Vikings, Eagles, Thursday Night Football. We're going to see how Shawn Desai and the Eagles handle the bunch concepts that the Vikings throw at them, as well as their answer to Justin Jefferson. He was shut down in that game last year, one of his rare games where he didn't have many receiving yards. And so we're going to see if the Eagles can kind of do that again to him. And then obviously we've already talked about Dolphins, Patriots, where we're going to see how the Patriots handle what the Dolphins throw at them, how the Dolphins handle what the Patriots are able to throw back at them. So that'll be really interesting as well. Those were the 3 topics we were talking about today. We went over kind of Dolphins Chargers and how Miami's offense was able to get to their next step of their offense and what that means for their Sunday night game. We also talked about how the defense is fighting back, how week 1 performance from the defenses was one of the better weeks from a defensive standpoint that we've seen in a long time, and then bunch concepts and what offenses are doing to kind of claim some of that momentum back on that side of the ball. So, we really appreciate everyone listening to this second episode of Stats and Scheme. it was so nice to get messages about our first episode coming out. Really appreciate everyone who sent those messages. Shawn and I both enjoyed seeing all of those. So please keep the feedback coming as we continue this show. Anything is helpful for us as we continue to put these out every Tuesday for you to listen to Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. And then as well, like Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov stream live on Mondays and Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. And then that episode comes out after. So be sure to listen to that as well as Parker Fleming's show, The Odd Men Front, coming to you on Thursday. So we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.